Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the More Than You See podcast, where I have meaningful conversations with creatives about their mental health journeys. Please note, I am not a licensed practitioner or therapist, but an actor and a filmmaker who is deeply interested in sharing my own struggles and exploring the mental health of others. My hope is that these conversations can bring you some joy, some personal understanding, and some tools so that you can build your own mental health toolbox. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the podcast. I am really excited because today I'm actually going to do a throwback episode. We are going to be replaying an episode from season 3 of the podcast where I talk about your identity as an artist and as a creative, and how having a passion and a career is two different things, and how sometimes they can collaborate and connect, but one thing does not have to equal the other. And I think this is very important right now as we are going into 100 plus days of the SAG-AFTRA strike. And I think a lot of actors, a lot of creatives are re-examining what it means to be an artist, what it means to show up for yourself and for your storytelling self, and, how we can continue to uh, pursue this career, but also maintain our livelihoods and be able to pay bills and all those super fun things. So I thought that resharing this episode would be really important because it kind of reminds you to re-examine this idea of who you are as an artist, as your career, and then who you are as a passion. And if those two things are no longer serving you, how you can potentially, separate yourself from that. Um, Next week, we're actually going to take a short hiatus, 1 week hiatus, but then the following week, we're actually going to have a really awesome conversation with another friend of mine who is a very talented multi-hyphenate. And we're going to talk a lot more about this, about identity, about how that evolves as you continue to grow and as your life changes, and how you can continue to show up for yourself as a creative, but that might look differently than it did 5 years ago. And before we jump into this episode, I want to also share one more thing. So, my partner has been reading this book, Atomic Habits, which I did talk about in the first season of the podcast. I highly recommend it if you have never read it. And it's been very interesting because it has reminded me that who you are who you are as far as your identity. So who you are as a writer, as an actor, as a creative, in whatever sense. It's really important to touch base with that side of yourself every single day, because that is showing up and being a professional. And he makes really compelling and important points about the fact that if you are a writer and you just write occasionally, that means that that might be a hobby. It may not be your profession. If you're a professional writer, that means that you're showing up and you're writing every single day. And so I think that as we continue to examine who we are and our place in this industry, as we continue on with the strike, and as we continue on post strike into whatever is the industry is going to be in weeks, months, whenever this strike is settled, I think it's really important to examine for yourself who you are professionally as an actor or creative or whatever career you're in every single day, and how you can continue to show up for yourself and show up as a professional, and whatever that means to you. That's something I know that I'm really examining myself, as far as like, what does it mean to be a professional actor for me, for Deborah, not for Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep's professional actor life is very different than Deborah's professional actor life. And so I've been doing a lot of reflection as far as like what that professional livelihood and identity means to me. So again, I hope you enjoy this flashback episode talking about identity and our professions and our passions, and how they may or may not correlate anymore. And I look forward to touching in with you guys in another couple weeks.
And this week, I'm going to share a couple different articles from Psychology Today that are specifically around identity and mental health. Now, I want to start off today's episode specifically talking about identity and whether or not we can over-identify ourselves in relation to our symptoms or our diagnosis. For example, if you go through something really traumatic, whether that be a life event or the death of a family member, which is a life event, but any kind of thing that causes tragedy or just causes any kind of big shift in your life that will then maybe cause some symptoms of depression, grief, loneliness, and being unable to sleep, anything like that. That is a symptom. And sometimes we can over-identify ourselves as being labeled by that symptom. So saying, and I am certainly have this issue where someone will ask me how I am, and my default will just be, I'm tired. And of course, there's a lot more to myself and my personal identity than the fact that I'm tired, but that's just like an easy thing that you can, go back to. Similarly, if you were, for example, going through a breakup or going through a divorce, there's often that, feeling or that gut reaction from someone that you're talking to where they automatically are like, are you okay? Are you still in grief? And so you are being labeled as someone in grief, whether or not you are or not. And that's something I've talked about in a previous episode, this idea of really identifying where people are and meeting people where they are instead of putting our own ideas of the situation on someone else. So really, separating those two things. I know personally one of the biggest struggles that I had when I was processing my divorce and going through this change in my own identity from someone who was married to someone who was single, my therapist would ask me all the time, who am I? Who am I outside of this relationship? Who am I besides being a partner to this other person? And that was something that I really struggled with for a very long time. And we would play this exercise all the time where she would say, tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with who you were as a partner or how your partner saw you, just like who you are separate from that. And I think that that's just an important exercise for everyone to do, where it's like, who are you outside of identifiers, outside of things that people label you? And something that my therapist reminded me about is like, who you are, part of your identity could be simple things. It could be what your favorite book is. It can be what your favorite flavor of ice cream is. It could be, do you prefer dogs over cats? Like all of those things have nothing to do with how you show up in the world. That is just little tidbits that are part of your identity. And it's so important for us to cling to those things, because even if you are feeling depressed, even if you are in a mental health crisis of some kind, those little identifiers are who you are, separate from how you're feeling and what is currently plaguing you or going on in your life at that moment. Now, one of the biggest things that we identify under or that we identify as, especially in Western culture, is what our profession is. And I really wanted to touch on this in this, 3-arc episode about identity. And I mentioned it last week as well, because I think that we kind of label our identity and cling to that profession as part of our identity more than we cling to any other aspect of our identity. Like someone will ask you what you do for a living over what you like to do for fun. Like, the default is always, what do you do? And what is your profession? And I think that it makes sense because it does say a lot about you, but you can also have a profession that isn't necessarily how you like spending your time. There's this idea between like, are you working to live? Are you living to work? And there's no wrong in either of those. I know that I identify with one of those more than the other, but that's just a part of my identity, but that doesn't make up my entire identity. That's not who I am. So I really wanted to have this conversation about profession and how it relates to identity, because I think that we can get so tied to our profession, and our profession being our passion. We have this idea in this country in particular that you need to follow your passion in order to succeed, in order to be happy, in order to feel most fulfilled. And I would like to kibosh that idea, because there is more to you than what you do. And you potentially could have a passion that is not what you do for money. I know that that is very much something that I identify with right now. I have a lot of passions right now that do not mean money, that I have to do other things in order to survive, in order to pay my bills. And there's a TED Talk that I'm going to link in the show notes that I think is also very, very important, and I would encourage everyone to listen to. This TED Talk is called Stop Searching for Your Passion. The speaker is Terry Trespicio, and basically what she talks about is why this idea of finding your passion is damaging to our culture, especially because this idea that we focus on one thing as our passion instead of, again, looking at this full identity, like who you are and what your passion could be today could be very different what your passion is in a couple weeks or a couple years. We all evolve and change, but we expect our passions to stay the same. And that is not realistic. That doesn't make any sense. And that's what this TED Talk is really about, challenging that idea that we just have one passion that we're supposed to be pursuing in our lives. And instead saying, what lights you up right now? Because that is the thing that's the most important. What is part of your identity right now? Now let's relate this back to mental health, because obviously that is what all of our conversations are about. And the reason why I think identifying this with mental health is so important is because I know for myself, I often feel like I am failing in life when I am not earning money or feeling successful in my passion. When I feel the most depressed and hopeless and feel like I'm struggling mentally, it is directly tied to not feeling like I'm living up to the expectations that I put upon myself. And I am very blatantly saying that I know these are expectations put upon myself. They're not put upon me by anyone else. And I think that that's why it's so important for us to be able to identify those things that are causing us distress and be able to say, is pursuing this passion causing me happiness or causing me distress? I think this idea is perfectly explained in another Psychology Today article that I'm going to link in the show notes. It's called You Are Not Your Work: How to Escape Workism and Reclaim Your Identity. And one of the quotes in this article that I think is so important says, if you tie your self-worth to your career, the successes and failures you experience will directly affect your self-worth. And I think that that perfectly encapsulates everything that I'm saying today in this idea that if we tie our identity to our passions, if we tie our identity to our profession more than anything else, we have the damaging potential that it is going to cause us to feel like we are not worthy and that our identity therefore is not worthy. And of course, that has a huge impact on our mental health. I think that's why, people always say that it's important to have other passions, have other things that, have some hobbies. But I think that it's just really important to draw these direct parallels between our identity and tying our identity so clearly to something that is a struggle. And of course, I know as a filmmaker and as an actor that this is something I struggle with on a weekly basis, but I am constantly trying to remind myself that I have so many other aspects of myself that are important, and that there's so many other components of me that make up my identity. And by focusing on these other aspects of my identity, it allows me to show up more fully in the world. And it also allows me to show up with more mental clarity and release some baggage and lack of self-worth and self-confidence in a lot of ways. So everyone's homework for this week is I would strongly encourage everyone to listen to this TED Talk. It really was very thought-provoking for me. And if you like her, she actually does have a book that just came out. That's how I discovered her. And I would also encourage you to think about the question, who am I? Who are you outside of your mental health diagnosis, outside of any symptoms that you're feeling from tragedies or different things going on in your life? Who are you at your core? And if you would like to share some different aspects of yourself, I would love to hear from you. I would love to listen.
Again, thank you so much for joining me for this flashback episode of the More Than You See podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it. And as I said in the episode, as a callback, please let me know like how you were feeling, how this episode resonated with you or didn't, how you are going to show up for yourself as a professional actor, or if these resources, this TED Talk, this New York Times article made you rethink some of the ways that you intend to show up as a creative in this industry. And it's also okay, let me remind you that you may feel one way today and you may feel a completely different way tomorrow. I know this friend that I mentioned I'm going to be interviewing, or the episode in a couple of weeks. We have had many conversations where she has felt like I'm all done with acting, and then 2 days later that completely changes, and that's okay. This is a career that is highly susceptible to change. It's highly both good and bad, and it's highly susceptible to be influenced by our emotions and the fact that there's so many other things going on in our lives, and our career is impacted by that. So just remind yourselves that however you're feeling right now, it may just be a fleeting moment or not, and that's okay. And the More Than You See community, myself, and I'm sure community members that you have around you are here to discuss those fluctuations, those changes, those ebbs and flows with you. I hope that you are kind to yourself this week. Please remember that you and everyone around you is more than you see. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in 2 weeks.